How the actual hell do binding vows even work? Why can Sukuna use them whenever he wants? What is a heavenly restriction, and how does one obtain it? All of these extremely illiterate questions will be answered in this poorly edited video. First, what even is a binding vow? A binding vow can be made with another person or oneself if the agreement is equivalent or if the other person agrees that it is equal. For example, Mahito and Kenjaku made a binding vow with Mekamaru, aka Kokichi Muta, that if he were to be a little rat and give them information, Mahito would use idle transfiguration to heal his body. Muta's body is a result of a special kind of binding vow. This is called heavenly restriction. Not all heavenly restrictions are as amazing as Toji or Maki's, and this one destroyed his body in exchange for increasing the area of his technique. Pretty terrible in my opinion, but I'll explain how these work later. When following through on the binding vow, Kenjaku warns Mahito of the dangers of not following through with said binding vow. He mentions that when making a binding vow with oneself, you can only lose what you've gained. When making a vow with someone else though, which I will be shortening to BV, breaking it with that person has some kind of unknown punishment that not even Kenjaku, a sorcerer who's been around for thousands of years, knows of. To further emphasize, we see Sukuna make a binding vow with Yuji that if he were to restore their heart, Yuji would let Sukuna take over his body for 1 minute if he did not hurt anyone, and if Yuji were to forget the vow. Even Sukuna was a little worried about breaking this vow and ripped Yuji's finger off. This binding vow held though due to Yuji's mental state of viewing himself as some sort of cog and not a human that needs to be worried about. Later on, Sukuna makes a binding vow with himself. For a one-time conditionless use of World Slash, every following World Slash would need chance, a pointed direction, and all of this is on top of the already required Enmaten hand sign. For those who don't know, this hand sign is also used for his original domain expansion. In Sukuna's eyes, this exchange was even and allowed him to chop an off-guard Gojo in half. Just because Sukuna sees it as even does not mean that he can have some sort of distorted view on what is even. Sukuna's knowledge of Jujutsu somewhat betrays him here as he knows what is equal and what isn't. This exchange is clearly even, despite many sorry-ass Gojo fans saying otherwise. However, I do want to mention it's hard to say what would happen if Sukuna were to break this vow. We don't know if it's impossible to break it, we don't know if Gojo would somehow come back to life due to him breaking it, but we do know Sukuna never does break it. The rule of one only loses what is gained is kinda hard to quantify here, meaning that breaking the vow is most likely impossible. Sukuna continues to cleverly construct binding vows regarding his other techniques, like Fuga. Sukuna takes his technique from pretty damn good to one of the strongest in the series. Sukuna limits his fire arrow to only being usable outside his domain in a 1v1 scenario. This is because Fuga has extremely low range and speed without the vow, so making the vow counteracts both of its weaknesses. When using it inside a domain, the number of enemies is inconsequential. He has Cleave and Dismantle pack the ground with combustible cursed energy, then uses his open barrier to seal all air inside, forming a sort of vacuum and making a giant explosion once Fuga is released. This is Sukuna's ultimate technique, only made ultimate due to his cunning. This also kills your favorite character. Heavenly restrictions are an interesting part of binding vows. Heavenly restrictions are placed on a person when they are born and are like massive permanent binding vows without the cool part of consent. Toji's was to forsake all cursed energy in exchange for incredible physical prowess. You might ask, why doesn't everyone have this, since normal humans aren't using cursed energy? And this is because normal humans have cursed energy, they just don't know how to use it. That's actually how curses are made. Humans who cannot control cursed energy leak it. Maki did not have access to this immediately because she had a useless twin. Jujutsu views having twins as sort of being the exact same person, meaning that since Mai had cursed energy, it was as if Maki's binding vow was being meddled with. So when Mai died, Maki unlocked her full heavenly restriction and later went on to rival Toji in power. Side note, I have this sort of headcanon that this is how Sukuna became so strong. He truly became one person, like Jujutsu believes. He consumed his twin, effectively doubling everything Sukuna has, which would explain his stupid curse energy amount and stupid efficiency. Let me know in the comments what you think of this theory, or if I'm just dumb. Binding vows are a lot more common than you think. They're prevalent everywhere in the series, even if it is not labeled specifically as a binding vow. For example, revealing your technique to an opponent to strengthen it can be seen as a sort of binding vow with oneself. revealing the workings of your technique in exchange for power or speed. Binding vows can even be seen with domains, like how Sukuna gives an escape route for his domain by making it open, thereby increasing its size tremendously. The most powerful way to use a binding vow is explained by Meimei. She states that the quickest way to improve as a sorcerer is to sacrifice your life. This is how she makes her birds so terrifying that even Sukuna avoids being hit by them. Furthermore, Todo improves his swap technique by entering a binding vow to increase the amount of taps needed to swap, making his boogie woogie impossible to counter. Nanami cleverly uses a binding vow called Overtime, which limits his power to 80% until it's time for him to clock out. When it hits 5 PM, his power goes to 120%. Another aspect of binding vows is sacrificing a part of yourself to improve something else. For example, both Hikari and Naobito sacrificed their arms to then increase the defensive curse energy shrouding the rest of their body. This saved both of their lives. Yorozu and Mai, who both share the construction technique, sacrificed their own lives to recreate cursed tools for their loved ones, those being the Soul Split Katana and Kabutoke. I'd like to add that construction is specifically stated to not be able to create cursed tools, meaning binding vows bypass stated rules all the time, not only for Sukuna. My final point I'd like to cover is that binding vows are not asspools. Even Kenjaku constructed the entire culling game using barriers and binding vows. He also uses barriers and binding vows to bring over curse techniques from previous bodies. It goes hand in hand for binding vows to be used by the most powerful and intelligent sorcerers. It's constantly shown throughout JJK that sorcerers are supposed to be con artists. The ability to surprise and trick your opponent is what makes a good sorcerer. Another aspect to becoming strong in JJK is the ability to envision something, a world where you win, a domain of your own, or a way to improve your technique tenfold. These are all reasons why binding vows aren't just a get out of jail free card that people can spam, but require cunning and an impromptu mindset to be able to pull this off. Sukuna isn't the only one who uses binding vows either. They are constantly used throughout the story by multiple characters. Gojo even uses them in his fight against Sukuna, swapping the internal and external conditions of his barrier, which can be seen as a sort of binding vow, even though not stated as such. Miwa used the binding vow against Kenjaku to sacrifice her entire katana swinging career in a single strike, which is clearly not impressive enough to hurt Kenjaku. This is because Miwa was never going to amount to anything. Sorry to all 3 Miwa fans. BVs don't always work either, so her single-use swing ended up doing nothing at all, proving binding vows have to be equal, and you only get what you trade in terms of value. That'll be all for this video today. Let me know what you guys want to explain next, if you want a versus battle, if you want a character for me to even power scale and look into and give you my opinion on. Make sure you guys like and sub if you thought I did a halfway decent job of covering this topic. Come join the live streams. They've been awesome. We've been playing Devil May Cry. The people in chat are sick. And we've just been chilling. So come check those out. Anyways, have a good night, my undead.